My wife left me for her ex who needed her more, so I put the Tesla keys back in my pocket and said good luck. For months later, she returned crying with a crowd behind her. I never imagined that a promotion I'd worked 6 months of overtime to secure would lead to the moment my marriage completely unraveled. But looking back, maybe the signs were there all along and I was just too focused on building our future to notice them crumbling beneath my feet. I'd been grinding through 60-hour weeks at the pharmaceutical research lab, analyzing clinical trial data until my eyes burned and my back ached from hunching over microscopes and computer screens, all to surprise Violet with something special when my supervisor finally approved my advancement to senior analyst with its substantial salary increase. I walked into our Phoenix townhouse that Tuesday evening in early November with genuine excitement coursing through my veins, the Tesla Model X keys practically burning a hole in my jacket pocket like a secret I couldn't wait to share with the woman I'd planned to spend my life building dreams with. The sleek silver SUV sat in our driveway like a metallic monument to everything I'd sacrificed to build our future together, its pristine surface reflecting the desert sunset and representing months of careful financial planning and disciplined saving. I found Violet in our kitchen, her marketing coordinator badge still clipped to her navy blue blazer, staring out the window toward the neighbor's yard with an expression I couldn't quite read but that seemed distant and preoccupied in a way that should have made me pause. When I pulled out the Tesla keys with a triumphant grin, expecting squeals of delight or at least some acknowledgement of what this represented for us financially and emotionally, she barely glanced at them before delivering words that felt like ice water flooding through my chest and down into my stomach. She told me she wanted a separation, that she needed to help Curtis get back on his feet after his restaurant bankruptcy left him emotionally devastated and financially ruined beyond repair. Curtis, her ex-boyfriend from college, the one who'd supposedly lost everything when his upscale bistro failed spectacularly 3 months ago according to the tearful phone calls she'd been taking in our bedroom late at night. She explained with clinical detachment that Curtis needed her emotional support more than I did right now, that he was struggling with severe depression and couldn't handle the pressures of life alone while dealing with creditors and business failure. While I'd been working those brutal overtime shifts, analyzing pharmaceutical compounds and regulatory compliance documents until my vision blurred, she'd been secretly planning her exit strategy to become his personal rehabilitation project and emotional crutch. She'd already packed 2 suitcases full of her essential belongings, she informed me with matter-of-fact efficiency, and would be staying at his downtown apartment indefinitely while he recovered from his supposed financial and emotional trauma that required her constant presence. I listened to her entire prepared speech with growing disbelief, watching this woman I'd loved for 4 years methodically dismantle our marriage with the same cold efficiency she used for her marketing presentations at the medical device company where she coordinated promotional campaigns. When she finished explaining how Curtis's immediate needs somehow trumped our wedding vows and the life we'd been building together, I calmly walked to my desk drawer and retrieved the business card for Patricia Sterling, the divorce attorney my brother had recommended after his own messy separation 2 years earlier. I handed it to Violet without a word of argument or pleading, told her she had exactly 2 hours to pack whatever else she needed from our shared home, and watched her face cycle through surprise, confusion, and something that might have been genuine panic as reality set in. She'd clearly expected tears, begging, desperate promises to change whatever had supposedly driven her away from our marriage, but instead she got practical logistics and immediate consequences for her calculated betrayal of everything we'd built together. That same evening, I stood in our doorway watching her load her belongings into Curtis's beat-up Honda Accord while rain began spattering our driveway, the Tesla sitting there like a gleaming symbol of everything she was walking away from for a man who supposedly had nothing left to offer her except emotional neediness. The truth about Curtis's supposed financial ruin came out in pieces over the following weeks, each revelation making Violet's abandonment seem even more calculated and foolish than I'd initially realized when she walked out our door that rainy evening. I discovered through casual conversation with our neighbor Margaret, who worked as a server at several upscale restaurants around Phoenix, that Violet had been meeting Curtis for lunch almost daily during her supposed busy periods at the marketing firm where she coordinated promotional campaigns for medical device manufacturers. Margaret mentioned seeing them together at expensive bistros downtown, not exactly the behavior of someone comforting a bankrupt ex-boyfriend who'd lost everything in a business collapse, but rather two people conducting what looked suspiciously like a romantic affair right under my nose. The real bombshell came 3 weeks later when I received an unexpected phone call from Derek Walsh, who'd been Curtis's primary food supplier before the alleged bankruptcy that had supposedly destroyed his life and livelihood. Derek called me because he'd heard through industry connections that Violet and I were separating, and he felt obligated to tell me the truth about Curtis's actual financial situation since he knew I was being deceived. Curtis wasn't bankrupt at all, Derek explained with obvious frustration in his voice, but had actually been thriving with his upscale bistro generating record profits throughout the summer and fall months when he was supposedly crying to Violet about his devastating losses. Not only was the restaurant successful beyond Curtis's wildest expectations, but he'd recently purchased nearly $40,000 worth of new kitchen equipment, including a commercial-grade wood-fired pizza oven and imported pasta makers that Derek had personally delivered and installed just 2 weeks earlier. The supposed emotional breakdown and financial devastation that required Violet's constant presence and support was nothing more than an elaborate manipulation designed to win back the woman who'd chosen me over him during our college years. I sat in my quiet townhouse processing this information while staring at the Tesla keys on my kitchen counter, realizing that Violet hadn't just abandoned our marriage for another man, but had been systematically deceived by someone who understood exactly how to exploit her sympathetic nature and desire to be needed by someone she perceived as vulnerable. The next morning, I called Patricia Sterling's law office and scheduled my first consultation, explaining the situation to her paralegal who assured me that cases involving adultery and abandonment typically moved through Arizona's court system with relative efficiency when one party was cooperative. Meeting with Patricia that Thursday afternoon felt like the first step toward reclaiming my independence from a relationship that had apparently been built on lies and manipulation from multiple directions. Patricia was a sharp woman in her 50s who'd handled hundreds of divorce cases, and she listened to my story with the detached professionalism of someone who'd seen every variation of marital betrayal imaginable over her 2 decades of practice. She explained that Arizona's no-fault divorce laws meant we wouldn't need to prove Violet's infidelity, but the fact that she'd abandoned our marital home to live with another man would certainly work in my favor regarding asset division and any potential spousal support claims she might attempt to make. As I drove home from that meeting in the Tesla that was supposed to represent our shared future, I felt an unexpected sense of relief washing over me like cool water in the desert heat that surrounded Phoenix during those November afternoons. For the first time in months, I wasn't wondering where Violet was during her lunch breaks, wasn't questioning why she seemed distracted during our conversations, wasn't trying to decode her increasingly distant behavior toward me and our marriage. Instead, I was looking forward to creating a life where I didn't have to constantly analyze someone else's moods and motivations, where I could focus on my pharmaceutical research without wondering if my wife was secretly planning to abandon everything we'd built together for a man who'd manipulated her emotions with fabricated sob stories about business failure and depression. Establishing a new daily routine without the constant drama and emotional turbulence that had defined my marriage became surprisingly natural, like finally being able to breathe properly after years of unconsciously holding my breath during every interaction with Violet. I woke up each morning in our quiet townhouse without wondering what mood she'd be in, whether she'd received another tearful phone call from Curtis during the night, or if she'd be distant and preoccupied throughout breakfast while scrolling through her phone with that secretive expression I'd grown to recognize and dread. My supervisor at the pharmaceutical research lab, Dr. Martinez, noticed the change in my focus and productivity almost immediately, commenting that my analysis of the latest clinical trial data showed a level of attention to detail and innovative thinking that impressed the entire research team. Without the emotional drain of managing Violet's unpredictable moods and her growing obsession with Curtis's supposed problems, I found myself genuinely excited about my work again, staying late not because I had to prove myself, but because I was genuinely interested in the compounds we were testing for potential breakthrough treatments. The phone calls from Violet started exactly 1 week after she moved in with Curtis, and they followed a predictable pattern that revealed just how poorly her rescue mission was actually going in the real world. She called during my lunch breaks, her voice tight with stress and what sounded like genuine regret, explaining that Curtis wasn't the broken man she'd expected to find but someone who seemed perfectly capable of taking care of himself when it suited his purposes. She admitted that his downtown apartment was actually a luxury high-rise unit with granite countertops and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Phoenix skyline, not the desperate circumstances she'd imagined when she abandoned our marriage to save him from his supposed financial ruin. During these increasingly frequent phone calls, she begged me to consider reconciliation, insisting that she'd made a terrible mistake and that Curtis had manipulated her emotions in ways she was only beginning to understand now that she was living with the consequences of her choices. I listened to these conversations with the detached interest of someone observing a laboratory experiment, noting how she consistently framed her situation as something that had happened to her rather than decisions she'd made deliberately over the course of several months. When she asked me to meet her for coffee to discuss rebuilding our relationship, I calmly explained that she hadn't made mistakes but had made calculated choices to deceive me while planning her exit from our marriage, and that the consequences of those choices were entirely her responsibility to manage. The relief I felt after hanging up those calls surprised me with its intensity, like setting down a heavy backpack I'd been carrying for miles without realizing how much it was weighing me down during every step of the journey. My evenings became peaceful in ways I'd forgotten were possible, ordering Thai food from my favorite restaurant that Violet had always complained was too spicy, watching action movies she dismissed as mindless entertainment, and maintaining the immaculate organization of our townhouse without having to navigate around her scattered belongings and half-finished projects. I bought myself premium coffee beans and a high-quality espresso machine, small luxuries that felt significant because I was choosing them for my own enjoyment rather than trying to compromise between my preferences and someone else's constantly changing demands and criticisms. The Tesla sat in our garage like a symbol of the independence I was rebuilding, and I took long drives through the desert surrounding Phoenix during weekend mornings, listening to podcasts about pharmaceutical innovations and financial planning without having to explain why these topics interested me or defend my choices to someone who'd never shared my professional passions. By the end of the third week, Violet's calls had become desperate enough that she started contacting my brother and even my parents, trying to convince them that I was making a huge mistake by refusing to forgive her momentary lapse in judgment that had led to temporary confusion about her priorities. The complete collapse of Violet's new life with Curtis began exactly 2 months after she'd walked out of our marriage, and the details reached me through a combination of her increasingly frantic phone calls and information from mutual acquaintances who seemed to take a certain satisfaction in updating me about her rapidly deteriorating circumstances. Curtis had disappeared without warning on a Tuesday morning in January, taking with him the $15,000 that Violet had borrowed against her credit cards to invest in his supposed restaurant expansion project that he'd convinced her would guarantee their financial future together. She'd maxed out 3 different credit cards and even taken a cash advance against her car title to fund what Curtis described as a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to purchase a second restaurant location in Scottsdale that would double their income within 6 months of opening. The money vanished along with Curtis, who left behind only a brief note explaining that he'd decided to relocate to California where a former business partner had offered him a management position at an established restaurant group that didn't require additional investment capital from naive girlfriends. Violet's job performance at the marketing firm had deteriorated so severely during her emotional turmoil over Curtis's abandonment that her supervisor placed her on probationary status, then ultimately terminated her employment when she failed to meet basic deadlines for client presentations and spent most of her workdays crying in the bathroom or making personal phone calls. Within 3 weeks of losing her income, she'd burned through her savings trying to maintain the luxury apartment Curtis had convinced her to co-sign for, then found herself unable to make even minimum payments on the credit card debt she'd accumulated to fund his fictional business ventures. The eviction notice came in February, forcing her to move into a budget extended-stay motel near the airport where she worked double shifts as a server at a chain restaurant, earning barely enough to cover her weekly room rental while the interest on her credit card debt continued accumulating at rates that made meaningful repayment impossible. During our phone conversations, which had evolved from weekly to daily to multiple times per day, Violet painted increasingly desperate pictures of her living situation while begging me to provide temporary shelter until she could stabilize her finances and find better employment. She described the extended stay motel with genuine horror, explaining how the walls were paper-thin, the air conditioning barely functioned during Phoenix's brutal heat, and her neighbors included transient workers and people in various stages of personal crisis who made sleep nearly impossible with their constant noise and drama. I listened to these descriptions with the same detached sympathy I might feel for a stranger's misfortunes, explaining repeatedly that her current circumstances were the direct result of choices she'd made to abandon our marriage and invest her future in a man who'd systematically deceived her for his own benefit. When she pointed out that I had plenty of space in our townhouse and could easily afford to help her get back on her feet, I reminded her that she was no longer my responsibility and that the woman who'd once told me Curtis needed her more than I did should probably contact him for assistance with her current problems. My divorce attorney Patricia Sterling kept me updated on the legal proceedings, which were moving forward with remarkable efficiency since Violet had essentially abandoned her claim to any marital assets when she chose to leave our home for another man's supposed financial emergency. The paperwork progressed smoothly through Arizona's court system while I enjoyed the financial freedom that came with supporting only myself instead of funding someone else's poor decision-making and emotional instability. My promotion at the pharmaceutical lab had included not just increased salary but also stock options and performance bonuses that allowed me to build genuine savings for the first time since our wedding, money that I invested in diversified portfolios instead of expensive dinners and luxury purchases designed to impress someone who'd never appreciated the sacrifices I'd made to provide them. 4 months after Violet walked out of our marriage to rescue Curtis from his fabricated financial crisis, I purchased the Tesla Model Y Performance in midnight blue that I'd been researching and saving for since my promotion became official, treating myself to every luxury feature and upgrade that caught my interest without having to justify the expense to someone who'd never contributed meaningfully to our household income. The car represented everything I'd learned about investing in my own happiness rather than trying to build a future with someone who saw me as a convenient source of financial security rather than a partner worth building dreams with over the long term. I spent a Saturday morning at the Tesla showroom in Scottsdale, taking my time to examine different color options and interior configurations while the sales representative explained the advanced autopilot features and performance capabilities that made this particular model superior to the family-oriented SUV I'd originally planned to surprise Violet with before she decided Curtis needed her more than our marriage did. The midnight blue paint gleamed under the showroom lighting like liquid metal, and the white interior felt luxurious in ways that reminded me how much I'd been compromising my own preferences to accommodate someone whose tastes ran toward flashy but impractical choices that prioritized appearance over substance. Emma, Violet's younger sister, appeared at my townhouse on a Thursday evening in March, looking uncomfortable and fidgeting with her purse strap as she explained that Violet had lost significant weight and was barely maintaining her mental health while working exhausting double shifts at the chain restaurant where she'd found employment after her marketing career imploded. Emma painted a picture of her sister surviving on ramen noodles and energy drinks, sleeping in a motel room that reeked of cigarette smoke and industrial cleaning chemicals, wearing the same 3 outfits repeatedly because she couldn't afford to replace clothes that were becoming increasingly worn and stained from her restaurant work. She begged me to consider allowing Violet to stay in our guest room temporarily, just until she could find better employment and stabilize her living situation, emphasizing that family should help each other during times of genuine crisis regardless of past mistakes and relationship problems. I listened to Emma's entire presentation while brewing coffee with the expensive espresso machine I'd purchased for myself, noting how she carefully avoided mentioning the specific choices that had led to Violet's current circumstances while framing her sister's situation as unfortunate events that had happened to her rather than consequences of deliberate decisions. When Emma finished explaining why I should feel obligated to rescue the woman who'd abandoned our marriage for another man's supposed needs, I calmly walked her to my garage and showed her the new Tesla, its midnight blue surface reflecting the overhead lighting like a mirror that captured every perfect curve and detail. I explained that this car represented the financial freedom I'd gained by no longer subsidizing someone else's poor judgment and emotional instability, pointing out the premium sound system and heated seats that I'd chosen specifically for my own enjoyment without having to compromise with someone whose priorities consistently conflicted with practical decision-making. Emma stared at the Tesla with obvious shock, probably calculating its cost while processing the reality that I was thriving financially and emotionally while her sister struggled with the consequences of choices she'd made voluntarily and deliberately over several months of planning. I told Emma that Violet had created her own crisis by choosing to abandon a stable marriage for a man who'd manipulated her emotions with fabricated sob stories, and that I felt no moral obligation to rescue someone who'd demonstrated such complete disregard for our wedding vows and shared future. The conversation ended with Emma leaving my townhouse in tears, muttering about family loyalty and forgiveness while I returned to organizing my home office with the methodical precision that brought me satisfaction after years of living with someone whose idea of organization involved leaving projects half-finished and belongings scattered randomly throughout whatever space she happened to occupy. That evening, I received 3 voicemail messages from Violet herself, her voice hoarse from crying as she begged me to reconsider Emma's request and allow her to stay temporarily while she rebuilt her life from the financial and emotional wreckage that Curtis had left behind when he disappeared with her money and her future. The final confrontation arrived on a stormy December evening when thunder rolled across the Phoenix Valley and rain pelted my townhouse windows with the intensity of a monsoon, creating the perfect dramatic backdrop for what would become the last time I'd ever have to deal with Violet's manipulation and the enabling family members who'd spent months trying to convince me that forgiveness was more important than self-respect. I was reviewing quarterly pharmaceutical research reports in my home office when the doorbell rang with unusual persistence, followed by urgent knocking that suggested whoever was outside had no intention of leaving quietly if I chose to ignore them. Through the peephole, I could see not just Violet standing on my covered porch in rain-soaked clothing, but an entire intervention team that included her parents Robert and Linda, her sister Emma clutching an umbrella, her best friend Casey from college, and even a man in an expensive suit who introduced himself as Mitchell Torres, the attorney Violet had apparently hired to help orchestrate this carefully planned emotional ambush. They'd clearly coordinated this surprise visit with military precision, timing their arrival for a weekend evening when they assumed I'd be home and vulnerable to their collective pressure campaign designed to wear down my resistance through sheer numbers and orchestrated guilt trips. Violet looked dramatically different from the confident marketing coordinator who'd walked out of our marriage 8 months earlier, her once perfectly styled blonde hair now showing dark roots and hanging limp around a face that had grown gaunt from stress and irregular eating habits caused by her financial struggles. She wore a discount store jacket that had seen better days and jeans that hung loose on her diminished frame, a far cry from the designer outfits she'd insisted on purchasing during our marriage while I worked overtime to fund her expensive tastes and lifestyle expectations. Her parents immediately launched into a coordinated speech about family values, second chances, and the Christian principle of forgiveness that I should embrace regardless of how deeply Violet had betrayed our marriage vows and abandoned our shared future. Linda clutched a tissue while explaining that Violet had learned valuable lessons about the importance of commitment and stability, while Robert nodded gravely and insisted that real men take responsibility for protecting their wives even when those wives make temporary mistakes in judgment. Emma chimed in with stories about how much Violet missed our life together, how she talked constantly about the comfortable townhouse and financial security she'd thrown away for a man who'd exploited her sympathetic nature and desire to help someone in genuine need. Casey, her college friend, tried a different approach by emphasizing how much Violet had matured through her suffering, claiming that hardship had taught her to value the steady, reliable love she'd taken for granted during our 4 years of marriage. Mitchell Torres, the attorney, attempted to frame the situation in legal terms, explaining that Arizona's community property laws meant Violet deserved consideration regarding the assets we'd accumulated during our marriage, though Patricia Sterling had already assured me that Violet's abandonment of our marital home severely weakened any claims she might attempt to make. I listened to their entire presentation while standing in my doorway, noting how they carefully avoided acknowledging the deliberate nature of Violet's choices and consistently framed her situation as unfortunate circumstances rather than predictable consequences of betrayal and poor decision-making. When they finished their coordinated plea for reconciliation, I calmly explained the difference between making innocent mistakes and making calculated decisions to deceive and abandon a spouse, pointing out that Violet had spent months planning her exit while lying about her afternoon activities and her emotional involvement with another man. Violet herself finally spoke, her voice breaking as she admitted that Curtis had manipulated her emotions and exploited her desire to feel needed, but I interrupted to remind her that she'd chosen to believe his fabricated stories while ignoring the reality of our stable, loving marriage. The rain continued pelting my windows as I walked them to my garage and activated the automatic door, revealing the midnight blue Tesla that represented everything I'd accomplished by prioritizing my own well-being over someone else's emotional manipulation and financial irresponsibility. Their expressions ranged from shock to anger to what looked like genuine fear as they processed the visual evidence that I was thriving without Violet, that I'd used my freedom to build exactly the life I'd always wanted instead of wasting energy on regret and second-guessing. I told them all to leave my property immediately and never contact me again, explaining that I'd built a peaceful, productive life without drama and manipulation, and that I intended to keep it that way regardless of how loudly they protested or how many tears Violet shed on my doorstep. After closing the garage door on that entire intervention circus and watching their headlights disappear into the stormy December night, I returned to my immaculately organized townhouse and poured myself 2 fingers of the premium Macallan whiskey I'd been saving for a special occasion, settling into my leather reading chair with the latest John Grisham novel I'd been anticipating since its release date. The thunderstorm continued raging outside my windows with impressive intensity, lightning illuminating the desert landscape while rain drummed against the glass in rhythmic patterns that created a surprisingly soothing soundtrack for my evening of complete solitude and genuine contentment. Inside my home, everything remained perfectly peaceful and exactly arranged according to my preferences, from the spotlessly clean kitchen counters to the carefully organized bookshelves that reflected my actual interests rather than someone else's attempts to impress visitors with titles they'd never read. My phone sat silent on the side table for the first time in months, no longer buzzing with desperate text messages, voicemails filled with tears and manipulation, or calls from family members trying to convince me that forgiveness was somehow more important than self-respect and personal boundaries. I knew with absolute certainty that this silence would continue permanently, that I'd finally severed every connection to the toxic relationship dynamics that had drained my energy and compromised my happiness for years while I tried to build a future with someone who saw me as a convenient source of financial security rather than a partner worth cherishing. The contrast between the chaos raging outside and the tranquil atmosphere inside my townhouse felt like a perfect metaphor for my emotional state, the storm representing all the drama and manipulation I'd left behind while my peaceful interior space reflected the calm stability I'd created by prioritizing my own well-being over other people's poor choices and emotional emergencies. I'd learned that genuine happiness came not from trying to rescue people who didn't want to be saved, but from building a life based on my own values, interests, and goals without having to constantly negotiate with someone whose priorities consistently conflicted with basic common sense and personal responsibility. The pharmaceutical research projects that occupied my weekdays had become genuinely exciting again now that I could focus completely on analyzing compounds and developing treatments without wondering whether my wife was secretly planning to abandon our marriage for another man's fabricated crisis. My financial situation had improved dramatically without the constant drain of funding someone else's expensive tastes and poor decision-making, allowing me to invest in experiences and possessions that brought me actual satisfaction rather than trying to impress someone who'd never appreciated the sacrifices I'd made to provide them. The midnight blue Tesla sitting in my garage represented more than just a luxury vehicle. It symbolized the freedom that came from making choices based on my own preferences rather than compromising endlessly with someone whose idea of partnership involved taking everything while contributing nothing meaningful in return. As the storm gradually subsided and the lightning moved further across the valley, I reflected on how every decision to prioritize my own happiness over Violet's manipulation had led directly to this moment of complete liberation from relationship dynamics that had slowly poisoned my sense of self-worth and personal satisfaction. I discovered that the best revenge against someone who'd treated me as expendable wasn't anger or bitterness, but the quiet satisfaction of building exactly the life I'd always wanted without having to explain my choices to anyone or justify my priorities to people who'd never shared my values. My home felt like a sanctuary where I could pursue my interests, maintain my standards, and enjoy the simple pleasure of making decisions based entirely on what brought me genuine happiness rather than what might prevent someone else's next emotional crisis or financial emergency. The silence that surrounded me wasn't empty or lonely, but full of possibilities and potential adventures that I could explore at my own pace without having to coordinate with someone whose idea of planning involved creating problems for other people to solve.